Hello and welcome to the third Thursday at Hoovers. I'm so glad you could join us this evening. I'm Brad Reiners, the Communications Director at the Hoover Presidential Foundation. We'll begin the program in a few minutes, but first I have a lot of news to share with you about upcoming events you'll want to participate in. We recently launched a new website called timelessvaluescampaign.org. When you visit that site, you'll learn about a major fundraising campaign for the renovation of the Hoover Presidential Library Museum exhibit space. It's been about 30 years since the last renovation, and we're excited about bringing new technology and other updates into the museum. You'll also learn about a special benefit for Iowa taxpayers who contribute to the Timeless Values campaign, and how you can earn a 25% Iowa state tax credit for your gift of any size, no matter how much that gift is. We've also created a series of short webinars that outline the renovation from what the need is to what will happen and how we'll get there. Those will air on Tuesday and Thursday nights during the first 3 weeks in May, and we'll take all your questions after each program. Watch your email for more details and registration links. Now, tonight I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Thomas Schwartz, the director of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum, as tonight's moderator. Tom, we have a lot of interest in tonight's topic.
Herbert Hoover surrounded himself with smart, reliable, and self-motivated individuals in his many food relief efforts. These are the people Hoover allowed to address him as chief, a sign that one was part of Hoover's inner circle of trusted associates. Branden Little, a professor of history at Utah's Weber State University, has been studying Hoover and the people around him that made his humanitarian relief efforts so successful. His forthcoming book, Band of Crusaders, Herbert Hoover, American Humanitarians, and the Remaking of the World, 1914 to 1964, describes in greater detail what you will get a foretaste of tonight. I invite you to enter questions at any time during the program through the Q&A feature you will find along the edge of your screen. You may also vote for questions someone else has entered if you would also like to hear those answered. As we may not have time to answer all the questions, the top vote getters will be asked first. Welcome, Branden. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Let's see. Okay, I've shared the screen and I believe you can hear me. Thank you, Tom. Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear Tom? Fantastic. Well, I appreciate you tuning in and am very delighted to be here this evening to discuss the results of a long-standing research project. And borrowing from a couple third Thursdays ago, Matt Schaefer, the indomitable archivist at the Hoover Library, and provided an autobiographical tour of his time at the archives. And I was inspired to do something similar in describing kind of how I came to this project and what I've learned as I've gone along. And so just a brief snapshot of this project is that it basically covers a half century, and it traces the ways in which World War I provided opportunities to Americans to do something that they'd never really done before, and that was get in the business of saving other nations. And Herbert Hoover, as many of you know, was front and center at this momentous time in human history. But he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by and assisted by a dedicated cadre of individuals who he himself would refer to as his Band of Crusaders, which is a title or a phrase that I've just come to love, in part because I think it captures the sense of historic importance that they realized that World War I occupied, but their lives would remain interconnected well into the 1950s and 1960s. So in other words, sort of a 50-year collective biography of Hoover and his insider deputies. But before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the Hoover Presidential Foundation has supported my research several times over the years. And without its support, much of this research couldn't have been conducted. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with you tonight and to reveal some of the findings I found in the collection at the Hoover Presidential Library. Along the way, its staff, including members like Matt Schaefer whoa, geez, there's Craig and there's a host of folks. Spencer, if you've ever been in the archive, you'll know these folks well, Lynn and Jim, and they've just made the challenges of conducting research all the easier. And I've done work in archives around the world, and I love working in archives. I call myself an archival tourist. If I can go to an archive somewhere, I will, and I surely will find something. But along the way, I personally think, and I've said it to the archivists in West Branch before, I think that the Hoover Presidential Library is the finest place to work in the world. And I truly mean that, because the staff there actually understands and supports historians digging through old materials, seeking to understand and make meaning of the past. So it's a fantastic place to work, and I couldn't think of any better place, honestly. And along the way, there's been a lot of people, some of whom are tuned in, I believe, who have encouraged me, who've read my work, who've criticized it, improved it, refined it, and shared with me material. Let me draw your attention briefly to this image here of a group of Americans sitting on a rooftop overlooking a cathedral, the major cathedral in downtown Brussels, Belgium in World War I. As some of you know, these are members of an organization Hoover helped to found in 1914 called the Commission for Relief in Belgium. It's a stunning picture, dramatic in form. Of course, the men are well dressed. And I'd like to draw your attention to a fellow in the bottom center. I'll highlight him on the next slide, but he's where this story begins, at least for me. And so sometimes I think historians write books, but you don't know why they wrote the book or why the book took the particular form that it does. And I will say that my book, I consider it finished, and it's just a question of finding the right publisher to put it in print. And so that's where we are at the moment. But there's a fellow circled in red here named Tracy Kittredge, who was an aspiring college professor of history. He had studied at the University of California, Berkeley, and at Oxford University when the war erupted. And I had not known of Kittredge at all, but one of my old mentors, a professor at the Naval Academy and Naval War College named Kenneth Hagan, said, "Hey, Branden, there's a collection of Kittredge's materials, this Navy lieutenant from World War I, down at Stanford University." I was then a PhD program, or at the PhD program in history at Berkeley, which is a hop, skip, and a jump from Stanford. And so I climbed in my car and went down to Stanford and started rummaging through Kittredge's materials, thinking I'd write a story about the US Navy in World War I. But what I found instead was a much more interesting story, and that was in this inset in the upper right of the picture, an unpublished book of Kittredge's called The History of the Commission for Relief in Belgium. In fact, the autograph there, if you're wondering, was to Kittredge's professor/mentor at UC Berkeley, a fellow named Henry Morse Stevens. But as I opened this manuscript, this book, it said that it claimed that Herbert Hoover and this group of Americans, Kittredge included, had helped to feed an entire country. And I was astounded. I had never heard this story, and I thought I was well read on World War I. And soon I was captivated, and I turned to Hoover's memoirs and looked, and sure enough, Hoover corroborated the story. But as all good historians do, we have to be a bit skeptical about what we read, who we listen to, and whether or not the claims of some are actually authentic, whether it's fake news, perhaps. And so I wondered, is what Kittredge and what Hoover wrote true? And if it was, how might I know in a way that would satisfy the burden of proof for other scholars? And I thought, well, maybe I could look at the organization, other humanitarian organizations, the American Red Cross, for example, and see what they did and see how they interacted with Hoover and his organizations. Believe it or not, this year turns nearly 20 years of work on this project. I've traced aspects of this story in Australia and Switzerland and Ireland, among other places, and of course at West Branch too. I will say that initially the story that I was composing was an effort to try and get away from Hoover, believe it or not. Maybe that's heresy, perhaps, but I didn't want to write a story or another biography of Hoover because it seemed that there were so many good ones. Of course, George Nash's was fantastic, and I met George relatively early in my PhD project days, and I didn't want to redo or attempt to redo George's work. And so I thought, well, I'll tell this broader story of how American humanitarians, including Hoover's deputies, were involved in all sorts of amazing work to save nations. But what I found as I continued to work on this project, I couldn't get away from Hoover. He was a magnet that drew all my attention and frankly warranted the attention, because it wasn't just Hoover being followed by a group of loyal deputies. They were loyal for sure, but Allied leaders, American leaders, world leaders, places like the Vatican and elsewhere, trusted Hoover with making life and death decisions in the First World War, with not only saving Belgium, but with saving other countries. And so as much as I had started off trying to write a broader story of Americans involved in the First World War, I realized that the real story was in fact Hoover, but I thought that it needed to be broadened beyond the First World War, well into the arc of their lives that stretched beyond even the Second World War. Oops. And so some of the things I found along the way. Kittredge and Hoover were telling the truth when they claimed that the United States, or at least Americans working under Hoover's leadership, were in fact saving Belgium from starvation. Of course, this is a simplification of the story, but there are wonderful books by George Nash and Jeffrey Miller that tell a lot of this detailed story about saving Belgium specifically. Wonderful and amazing tales. But most of the work, it seemed, on Hoover's humanitarian contributions had focused really in and around the World War I years, say 1914 to even the early 1920s. Bert Patnaug's work on the American Relief Administration, which was involved in combating famine after World War I in places like Russia, was part of this story too. But it seemed to me that that not only had Hoover fed a country and fed tens of millions of people, but that he fundamentally changed the way Americans looked at the world. And it seemed that that was a theme that warranted emphasis. And so, as I've indicated here in sort of a couple images, these posters on the left was one of the war organizations that Hoover led, called the Food Administration. And there you see a Belgian mother and emaciated children. And the plea for Americans is to conserve food. And I imagine many of you have seen similar images. But the message came out in 1917 when the United States marched off to war. Above there, you see President Wilson echo this theme about fighting for the rights and liberties of small nations. Well, what nation do you think he was thinking of most? Well, it turns out it was Belgium, first and foremost on his mind, in large part, because of Wilson's proximity to Hoover and the fact that the CRB, that Commission for Relief in Belgium, was successfully saving a nation. American abilities were on full display at this critical moment. And so Americans arguably started to see that they could save other nations, that they should do so, and that they really needed to do so in part to combat the ugliness of war, as suggested in this green-hued Remember Belgium poster, where a German soldier is carrying off a young Belgian girl to do dastardly things. Images perhaps not much different than we see in the international news today. But along the way in this war, and in the few years after the First World War, of course, communism emerged as a major theme. And individuals like Wilson and Herbert Hoover and their supporters were very much opposed to the expansion of communism. And they believed that if you could sustain people, rebuild their lives and provide basic necessities, that they wouldn't be radicalized, that they wouldn't turn communist. In many ways, the theme was, if you give a man bread, he wouldn't turn red or red communist. And so this idea of combating communism as a humanitarian and a strategic necessity, as a moral imperative, I argue is one of the ideals that Hoover helps to enshrine in the American public and its mind, and helps to provide a mechanism for combating communism via food. Let's see, next slide. Hoover and his deputies, his crusaders, were not a flash in the pan group. They were certainly forged in the fires of Belgium during the First World War. They certainly worked together in the aftermath of the First World War, but they would remain close as a fraternity for the next 50 years. And I was fascinated by their not only their interconnections, but their relationships. And fortunately, this was a generation of people who liked to write. They wrote letters, they had reunions, they remained in touch. And as a result, there's tremendous documentation about this vibrant series of relationships between Hoover and the men and some of the women who surrounded him, undertaking these transformative projects. But believe it or not, I think that after World War II, Hoover and his deputies gained an even greater importance. We tend to focus on World War I, rightfully so, but believe it or not, Hoover, the post-President Hoover, of course, the Depression-tainted Hoover, returns to a position of tremendous importance in American politics and society under the Truman administration, under the Eisenhower administration, and even under the Kennedy administration. During these decades of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, one of the things I've traced in this book is the ways in which Hoover and his insiders attained positions of prominence in Congress, held positions of tremendous influence in forming international aid organizations such as UNICEF and CARE, and how the arguments that they made and the organizations that they spearheaded became normalized in American life. In other words, it became part of America's global responsibility to feed others, to help others, to defend freedoms around the world. And believe it or not, Hoover's behind a lot of this. There he is, standing tall in a city that, in a German city, there's the rubble of the town and people scouring and scavenging behind. In this particular moment, after World War II, Hoover undertook 2 international surveys, one of which was a food survey to combat international famine. And I've identified that Hoover was actually critically influential in combating what was threatening to be a famine that would kill a third of the world's population. Along the way, as Hoover traveled on that international mission in 1946, he negotiated bilateral agreements with countries that had food surpluses to gift their surpluses to countries that had deficits and would starve. And so this grand catastrophe that could have ended or been at the end of an Allied victory in World War II never occurred. And so guess what? We don't write about it. It never happened, largely because of Hoover's efforts. You've probably heard of the Marshall Plan, and for good reason. But a lot of the inspiration for the Marshall Plan, in fact, comes from Hoover. And also, actually, Hoover and Marshall were very tightly connected. They discussed these initiatives. And if it weren't for Hoover, the GOP, the Republican Party, would not have supported the Democratic initiative under the Marshall Plan, the way in which it did. So we can credit Hoover with not only inspiring the need to save lives in war-ruined Europe, but also in Asia, and helping to provide the mechanisms for undertaking such relief. Not all of the Marshall Plan is Hoover's doing, but nevertheless, its inspiration and a lot of the parameters were very much Hooverian in inspiration. The last slide I have to share with you, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, I trust, is that what I believe I've found is that the United States gets in the business of doing a host of international things. Some of these are sometimes called modernization. Some of these programs are called foreign aid. Of course, there's a host of unlimited armed intervention and military activity abroad, which Hoover was not a champion of. But much of the inspiration for building bases overseas, for sending foreign aid, and actually intertwining money for children's milk powder under UNICEF food programs and putting it in the Defense Department budget came from Hoover and his deputies. Hoover and his deputies were working behind the scenes time and again, and they don't get the credit that they actually deserve for funneling American funds and resources into a host of lands that helped to build a very positive reputation of the United States. Of course, there are a host of hawks as well and others who advocated armed intervention too, and led to a series of interventions in countries like Vietnam. But I think we can trace this arc of story from saving Belgium to efforts to save distant lands like Vietnam. That American know-how, American abilities could fundamentally remake other societies and save them from catastrophe. One of those deputies of Hoover's, if you will, a disciple, is this fellow Morris Pate here, depicted in his young passport photo from World War I. And Pate would go on to establish UNICEF, but his role and his executive leadership, his ideas were all Hooverian, and he remains closely tethered to Hoover. And they died just a year apart. They were almost like father and son. In the backdrop there, you see a picture of refugees. These are Hungarians, not Ukrainians, but Hungarians. And what they're doing is ultimately trying to flee the Soviet Union and to be admitted to the United States. This program occurred in 1956. So Hoover's in his 80s, and guess what? President Eisenhower, who knew Hoover well, relied on Hoover and Hoover's advice to appoint the appropriate people, old Hooverians, I might add, to lead this program to help bring Hungarian refugees to the US. If anything, they were good anti-communists. And so to draw a close to my comments, well, I want to identify that Hoover and his inner circle of about a dozen individuals were powerfully influential in the formation of American foreign policies that led the United States into an ever-expanding realm of activity overseas, much of it humanitarian. And they also inspired the formation of many of the principles by which humanitarian aid organizations, international and American, would adopt these initiatives. So the Hoover and his deputies have a profound role throughout the 20th century. And we, in many ways, live with the world that they helped to create. So I will unshare my screen, and hopefully we can return to comments. If I can unshare, let's see. Oops, stop share. Okay.
Okay, Branden, thank you for that. I'll wait for some more questions to get into the Q&A box. And being the moderator, I can preempt everyone by asking a couple questions to start. Morris Pate is an interesting fellow. He was offered the Nobel Peace Prize. He was dying of cancer, and he refused to accept it for himself, but rather for the organization, for UNICEF, which to me, again, is kind of a very Hooverian kind of response. Can you tell us some more about the band of crusaders that went on to assume leadership positions in what today we call non-governmental organizations or even governmental organizations? And then my second question, can you think of any other organization which had a leader that could call upon people at a moment's notice to drop what they were doing and, you know, join to help and whatever the latest endeavor was? I mean, it seems like Hoover's folks would just quit what they were doing and join him in a humanitarian effort, and all without compensation. I mean, these people kind of did it out of pocket, or else Hoover found some kind of way to run money through an organization to pay for their ability to work with him without them knowing it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for those two questions. In terms of that fraternity, if you will, those band of crusaders, certainly Morris Pate was one of these individuals who Hoover acknowledges having obtained this important position in helping to establish UNICEF, the UN International Children's Feeding Organization, at the very end of World War II. And Pate runs it unto his death in the 1960s. So he's a long tenure. And yes, he turns down the Nobel. He doesn't want to draw attention to himself. I find that Hoover does this too, where Hoover invariably sought to minimize his own direct contributions. And so Pate's following in the chief's footsteps, as he would call him, about how to cast attention where it rightfully rests, and that is on the crisis and the need for resources rather than on the leaders themselves, who would be working to solve these crises, often behind the scenes. Some of Pate's other associates and Hoover's deputies include an American senator from New Jersey named Alexander Smith. And Alex Smith came to work alongside Hoover early in World War I and became a lifelong disciple. When he's a prominent member of the House Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Relations Committees, Smith will write legislation that is designed to assist or interlink humanitarian aid to many of these overseas missions to combat communism in the 1950s and 60s, alongside another fellow named Christian Herter. Herter, of course, was governor of Massachusetts for a while, but he knows Hoover in World War I, and the two of them remain connected. Of course, Herter moves on to become the second Secretary of State under Eisenhower's presidency. But what I found striking in researching Herter and Smith, these members of Congress, was that oftentimes they would draft legislation and they would send it to Hoover. They wanted his feedback. They wanted his recommendations for how to improve American foreign aid legislation. And Hoover would invariably comply. They have meetings in New York, they have meetings in Washington, they have correspondence back and forth. But what they're doing is they are coordinating their efforts and enhancing them along the way. And so when some of this legislation is enacted for what's called mutual security assistance, and Hoover's nowhere to be found, but his imprint is everywhere to be seen if you trace it through the behind the scenes correspondence. CARE is one of these other organizations established by Hooverians in the First World War, or who worked with Hoover in the First World War, and then enshrine it after World War II as a way to help feed people. And there's one other fellow I should mention, and his name was Hallam Tuck. His nickname was Friar, apparently, for a while, which is good fun. But Tuck joined the CRB in World War I and remained committed to Belgium forever. But he's one of these individuals you mentioned in so many ways, Tom, is that Hoover, or at least Tuck's wife, recalled that at the beginning of World War I, Hoover called Tuck and said that he needed him to basically undertake a food survey of a country that had been invaded by the Nazis. And the first thing that Hallam said was, "Yes, Chief, I'm ready." He didn't ask when or where, he didn't ask for money, he just said he'd be willing to go. instantly, drop everything at the drop of a hat. And your question, can I think of anybody else who commanded such instantaneous loyalty and devotion, even to the point where it financially hurt and risked lives? I can't think of another person besides Hoover. And what's striking is so many people think of Hoover as a non-charismatic individual, as a cold fish, perhaps, thinking of the fishing president. He loved to fish, but Hoover's not that way at all among his inner circle of deputies. They love him, they're dedicated to him, and the reason being is because they understood that he was willing to sacrifice even more than they, willing to risk his life when he didn't need to travel through war zones continually, expose himself to gunfire, aerial bombardment, submarines, sea mines, disease, and he does it without really seeking recognition. Now, he gets recognized, of course, but in so many ways, he's seeking to draw attention to the cause rather than himself.
One of the surprises for me, that it's almost like this group acted as though in the same way that we do for a high school reunion gathering or college alumni gathering. They had their own little bulletin that went all the way up to Hoover's death in '64 that they published, and people would provide updates about what was going on in their lives. I mean, they really did feel like a connection to one another.
They absolutely did. And what's wonderful about those bulletins is that Hoover established several organizations. One of them, of course, was the Commission for Relief in Belgium. There was the American Relief Administration, and there's a number of others, and so many of them are intertwined and populated by the same people. But they belonged to these organizations. They had regular reunions. They had impromptu reunions in foreign capitals or wherever they worked or traveled, and they corresponded. And there, in fact, some of them didn't even know each other. But Hoover and others would simply suggest, all you have to do is say, I know the chief. I worked with Hoover, and that would be the ticket of entry, and the bonds would be forged instantaneously. It looks like you're muted, Tom.
I am, yeah. Okay, let's go to some of the questions here. Russ asks, is it possible to say both he and his wife are equally vital, or at least she is as involved as her husband, or that she is part of that inner circle?
That's a great question. Equally vital. Well, in so many ways, she's the you could say the behind the scenes support for so much of his activity. Of course, she dies young, relatively speaking, in the 40s, and Hoover was bereft for a while, and surrounded himself with who? His inner circle of deputies after that. But in World War I, there's a good period of time where she's not around, and she goes back and forth, and she risks her life. And there's so many times when he travels overseas without her, of necessity. But she's a continual presence, and one that supported every step of the way. There are sort of insider little stories of where he and she, Herbert and Lou, will alter basically divide their bank accounts in case one of them dies, so that they both have the means or that she has the means to survive in case of his death without any immediate inconvenience financially. And she's very supportive of him. And actually she was very upset also with what she felt was bad treatment by the Roosevelt administration. And Hoover felt that kind of frustration may have factored in her death. So she's behind the scenes throughout.
Connie asks, can you expand upon the relationship of Hoover with Truman and Eisenhower?
Oh, that's a good question. Hoover had a fascinating relationship with Truman and Eisenhower, although not initially. Of course, Hoover was an international humanitarian statesman in World War I. He's part of Wilson's war cabinet. In other words, he's part of the Washington elite at a time when Truman and Eisenhower were junior officers in the US Army. So in other words, Hoover was a big name in World War I, and we often well, maybe not so much the folks gathered tonight, but generally most Americans, if they think of World War I leaders, they think of course, Woodrow Wilson as president, maybe General Pershing, but Hoover's not part of that cast of characters. He should be. The Allied governments recognize Hoover is equally important to Woodrow Wilson for his trailblazing work in rebuilding and rehabilitating Europe after World War I. But after World War II, Hoover comes to prominence again. Of course, he's looking for, you could say, an opportunity to rehabilitate his reputation that had been tarnished in the 1930s. He remained a powerful figure in the GOP in the 30s, but he's looking for opportunities. And of course, I'd argue this, he's the only one who's willing to put in the hard hours that much of this aid work entailed, and to do it for free. And so Truman will come to appreciate that Hoover was willing to work with him. Truman needed somebody that was capable of surveying the world's humanitarian distress and also economic distress. They're intertwined. And so Truman deputizes Hoover. And actually Eisenhower has a critical role in this too. I believe that Hoover helps Truman to come to the realization that American foreign policy, for a moment in 1945, 46, and early 1947, was going in absolutely the wrong direction. We were dismantling industry in Japan and in Germany. In other words, making conditions worse, unsurvivably worse, and making people angry, which in many ways was the opposite of the lesson of World War I, which was if you treat your defeated enemy well, they won't become Nazis. At the end of World War II, the United States was undertaking to basically punitively treat defeated Germany and defeated Japan. And Hoover said, this is counterproductive, this is harmful. One general in Europe, well, there are several, but one of them, named Eisenhower, completely agreed. There's another one in Japan called MacArthur. And one of the iconic statements that MacArthur made was, send us troops or send us food in order to quell insurrections in Japan or to feed the people. Of course, there aren't any troops to send really in 1946, 47. Most of the army's been demobilized. And so Truman, Hoover, Eisenhower, and MacArthur worked together to reorient American foreign policy. I should throw in there George Marshall too. They revise American foreign policy to be the good guys, to remake these countries, to befriend Germany and Japan, and we can look at the enduring alliance relationships today. But Hoover's role in this is pivotal, and the Army, US Army, relies on Hoover to figure out how to feed people. And we can see this in the correspondence between American occupation generals and Hoover and his deputies.
Thank you. So Evelyn asks, some young European researchers and historians assert that the CRB was merely the import arm of the Comité National, and that the US did very little, if anything, to feed Belgium, France, Poland, etc. Can you speak to this current thinking?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you, Evelyn. In other words, how vitally important was the American contribution to feeding Belgium in World War I? And believe it or not, it's a complicated answer, in part because the practical work of feeding Belgians, feeding an entire nation, fell truly on the Belgians themselves. And of course, on the people in northern France that the CRB helped also. So it wasn't as if Americans single-handedly, or with a couple dozen Americans working inside Belgium, were literally able to feed all of Belgium and German-occupied northern France. They weren't. But what I would argue that the most important American contribution was provided, especially in the early years of the war, when the United States was neutral, 1914 to 1917, that American neutrality was the diplomatic shield that enabled the aid work to begin and to develop the momentum that was carried through even after the United States joined the war as a warring power. And so the US, you could say, supervisory and administrative role led by Hoover was indispensable to the defeating of Belgium. Of course, most Americans didn't pay much attention to the inside role of the Belgians in cooking the food, distributing the food, basically doing a lot with taking care of themselves. But if it wasn't for the American leadership, I'd argue, the CRB couldn't have saved Belgium. But it's fair to say that those domestic armies of volunteers and the leaders in those aid organizations inside Belgium and northern France were part and parcel to saving their peoples from catastrophe.
Paul writes, did many of his crusaders follow him to the Department of Commerce and the presidency as assistants and/or aides?
That's a great question too. Very few follow him into the Department of Commerce, although some of them become members that are appointed to various advisory commissions that President Hoover and also, of course, Secretary Hoover will organize. And very few follow him into the White House, in part because they have other jobs. In World War I, aid work for many of them was a temporary job. There are very few people found humanitarian jobs to be career fields, but they were entry points. And so that fellow I highlighted, whose book, Tracy Kittredge, that kind of led me on this path to Hoover, he becomes the Secretary General of the League of Red Cross Societies in Geneva, Switzerland, in the 1920s. Some of Hoover's other deputies find roles in banking and international trade. Some of them remain in Europe, in large part because they met people, they came to fall in love with Europe. They often married European women, and they built lives within Europe, and so they retain this continuity. But it's right as World War II erupts again that relationship that had been maintained through regular reunions, this small fraternity of individuals in the CRB and the ARA especially had met regularly or tried to do so, kept in touch. So when World War II re-erupts, they endeavor to undertake a host of new aid organizations similar to the CRB. So yeah, they're closely connected, but not working for him per se.
Okay, thank you. Dr. John Little asks, could you explain how Hoover was able to get shiploads of food sent to and from other countries sent to Belgium?
That's a great question, Dad. Thanks for the question. Well, logistically, this is one of those complex stories. Hoover's credited with organizing and orchestrating a fleet of some 70 ships, ocean-going ships during World War I. And part of the reason he understood international commerce and finance well was because before the war, he had a fairly vast and sprawling international consultancy involved in mining industries that stretched the globe. So he was aware of commodities, shipments, and prices, and exchange rates of different currencies, and how to move things from one part of the world, say raw ore of various kinds, to smelters on the other side of the world. And that logistical and administrative expertise played effortlessly into Hoover's management of this food operation, which in and of itself was pretty complex. To find the ships was difficult. To ensure that they were safe on the high seas was even more difficult. And then, of course, to arrange the financing too was always precarious. By the way, most of the money that went into feeding these countries was not outright gifts by, say, American charity. Most of the money came from the British government, the Belgian government, the French government. There were certainly invaluable American contributions financially, private and governmental, but most of the monies that came, say, for just feeding Belgium, came from European governments themselves that Hoover used to acquire food on the global market and to feed people who needed it.
You really, though, in that answer, underscore something that's overlooked by so many, and that Hoover's mining career really gave him the skills, and so much of this humanitarian effort involved logistics and, you know, being able to move something from here to there in the most inexpensive and efficient way.
And I'd like to highlight in relationship to this that if you were to read Hoover's Principles of Mining book, which I'd encourage everyone to do, it's perhaps not the most exciting book, but it is so radically different than what he will soon start writing as he appeals to people to help feed the Belgians. And he really goes on the stump for speaking on behalf of the Belgians to the point where he will choke up and cry in public, which is, for Hoover scholars, astounding that he displayed that depth of emotion. But he does so in a New York audience in front of dignitaries like Henry Cabot Lodge and Henry Stimson, some major figures in American foreign policy who were astounded by what Hoover was achieving. But Hoover translated that business knowledge very well into this global operation for humanitarian aid. But one of the things he doesn't carry over is making a profit for himself. And there's a common misunderstanding, it seems to me, that a lot of skeptics, and it makes sense to be skeptical, doubted Hoover's benevolence. They doubted his altruism. They were convinced that surely he was in it for the money somehow. But Hoover, time and again, will turn down job offers that were extraordinarily lucrative. He turns down the offers to maintain his own business practices. At a moment when business, especially in mining, provided all sorts of lucrative fortunes for people, Hoover walks away from it. And he turns to risk his life year after year after year, and he's working 14-hour days often, day after day after day, for really no compensation. And one of the things he writes to his wife, speaking of Lou, early on, is he said, you know, if we keep this up, we might be bankrupted. Should I go on? And she says, yes.
Okay, Russ asks, why is there such a disparity between the public view of Hoover and the view his aides have of him?
That is another conundrum of explaining Hoover, I think. And I differentiate the public a little bit, if I could, because I think part of the image that we have of Hoover today, at least at a popular level, where if you mention Hoover in passing, maybe outside of Iowa, you know, at least when I have students, if they've ever heard of Hoover, they've heard simple things like, oh, he was a do-nothing president who's responsible for the Depression. He caused the Depression, or things like this. And most historians today completely reject this outright and find Hoover a much more sympathetic individual, a much more dynamic president who in many ways was tarnished and remains tarnished. Many Americans in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s actually liked Hoover. And there were those diehards who didn't. In fact, at the Truman Presidential Library, if I could mention another library, there's all sorts of hate mail that Truman received when he brings Hoover aboard. It's what, I mean, at some point I need to write about this specifically, but there are people who thought Truman was betraying Roosevelt's legacy by collaborating with his enemy, Hoover. So I think the public story is a little more complicated, but the popular impression remains that Hoover didn't do as much as he could have. Of course, who writes those interpretations? are very skilled historians who are all pro-Roosevelt historians and friends of the Roosevelt administration. There's a number of them, very influential, prominent writers in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, who all sing Roosevelt's praises. Of course, this echoes with Churchill too. And Hoover falls by the wayside. He's an afterthought. Hoover's aides understand, to a degree that nobody else does, the amount of work that this stuff involved, the risk, the sacrifice, the long, weary hours, and the lack of credit that any of it really ever gained. Nobody really knows about Hoover's post-World War II work, aside from the handful of people who write about it. But Hoover's got a tremendous role in American foreign policy right at the end of World War II. And then Eisenhower picks it up and relies on him, and John F. Kennedy, whose father was a friend of Hoover's. It's old Joseph Patrick trusted Hoover. And so Kennedy's ideas about rebuilding the world and making the world a better place in mud huts and elsewhere around the world, in part, I argue, draws from Hooverian thought.
Helen, did his childhood influence the humanitarian traits?
Did his childhood influence? I think so. There's a lot made in certain writing about Hoover's Quaker upbringings. And I think it's harder, I find it harder to establish a deep Quaker influence on Hoover as an adult, although it's certain, I think, in the background. But where I think his childhood is more anchored to his humanitarian concerns is his orphaned upbringing. He's orphaned at a fairly young age. He has a sensitivity to loss. And to my understanding, he never goes without, but that emotional pain of losing parents and basically being sent to live with relatives is one that I find tethers him very closely emotionally to the children he's trying to help. And he establishes this bond with children for the rest of his life. There's a fellow named Jim Torrey whose father was a CRBer. And Jim told me not long ago that in the early 60s, young Jim was invited to Hoover's apartment to dine with Hoover in the Waldorf Astoria. And Hoover just absolutely doted on him. And this was, of course, the frail Hoover, the aged Hoover, the Hoover who didn't have teeth. And while his guests were eating lamb chops, Hoover was eating stewed tomatoes and scrambled eggs because they were soft. There's an intimacy and a willingness to reveal himself to children in ways that I think we overlook. But I think it starts when he's a kid, and he never forgets it.
So that kind of hits on the question that Mary is asking. Have you been in contact with any of the Crusaders' families or descendants?
Yes, I have. I've tracked a number of them on my own, as well as actually through the good services of a CRB grandson named Jeff Miller, who's written a series of fantastic books on the CRB, and I highly encourage everything Jeff has done. Great reading and fantastic scholarship. I mean, the research he's done. Actually, we met at the Hoover Presidential Library years ago. Jeff and I did. But Jeff has done the most in establishing those fraternal and family connections, and some of the families know of their relatives' contributions, and some don't. And that's where I think it's most exciting to engage people, to help educate them that their relative played a transformative role in saving millions of lives in the midst of often the world's greatest disasters.
So the final question here is from Tina, and she asks, why Belgium?
Why Belgium? Ooh, why Ukraine? It rallies the heart and the mind. It moves us It's a moral quandary. In 1914, this little country was steamrollered by what was then the world's largest army. And suddenly Americans got captivated and entranced by what was occurring there. Some people say it's because of British propaganda, and I challenge that idea, because there are lots of Americans traveling in Belgium at the beginning of World War I, including future luminary writers like Walter Lippmann. President Wilson's sister is over traveling in this neck of the woods. There are a lot of Americans who were privy to witness this calamity as it exploded in Belgium, and they brought their stories of horror and hardship and of refugees. They're streaming out with other refugees to England and other places. Atrocities is another thing that captivates Americans. Not only was Belgium suddenly invaded, its neutrality violated, but soon stories, and they're not just fictitious, they're horrifying, where German troops march into particular villages and machine gun the inhabitants. And they burn things, they pillage, they plunder, they destroy. And I find, you could say, many of the mirror images with discussions about Ukraine quite similar. The other idea is a celebrity leader. Maybe not Zelensky, but his name was King Albert. He's leading his troops in the field. And Americans saw in Belgium, I think, a similar ideal to the Alamo, that you could find in their tenacious defense of their homeland principles and people that you could support. But the threat of starvation of an entire nation was something that nobody had anticipated prior to World War I. And suddenly, when it becomes aware to the American people that if they joined and partnered with this organization, they didn't even really know Hoover's name, but if they partnered with his organization, they could feed a nation and prevent a mass catastrophe. And they rally around Hoover to do that. And as they do, they learn about Hoover, and they entrust him with doing ever more. Congress, the White House, and the State Department rely on Hoover and his deputies. They trust them, they trust what they're doing, and you could say the rest is history.
So we'll end with Vicky's comment in the chat box. I was 14 when Hoover came to West Branch to dedicate the Hoover Presidential Library. It is a wonderful memory, and I was struck by the enormity of all he and the Hooverians had done as I perused the displays of his lifelong humanitarian works. I know the library staff work hard to get the word out about all his good works, but I'm still frustrated in general that so many want to write him off as only connected to the Great Depression. I'm continually surprised at the number of people who seem to know nothing of these good works. Any last thoughts about that?
Well, I guess that's the struggle that many of us encounter who are writing stories that challenge our existing understandings. And often these stories take a long time to research and to tell. But whenever they're told, I find that people are really receptive. And so I think part of the public educational goal or outreach of conveying the centrality of Hoover to the 20th century, not just an afterthought or not just a minor figure associated with a one-term presidency, but a transformative figure, will help us perhaps to see him as a vibrant part of establishing these foundations and creating expectations, creating ideas about how the world can work better. He's an advocate of the Good Samaritan ideal always, that you should treat others well because you should. And so I think that the more we think of Hoover in these ways, hopefully other people will agree. And so I thank you for tuning in and asking these fantastic questions.
Yeah. So if your book gets picked up by Hollywood, who are you going to cast as Hoover?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, there are certain Hollywood-esque stories in here. There certainly are. High drama, tremendous drama and excitement and adventure. I don't know. I'll have to think about that, but I'd love it. I'd love to see it happen.
Well, thank you, Branden. That's all we have time for questions for now. And I'd like to thank our speaker, Professor Branden Little, for his presentation tonight, and also all of the public libraries who helped make tonight's program a success. Remember, the Presidential Museum is now open 7 days a week from 9 to 5. And I invite you to visit our temporary exhibit called Hoover Heads, featuring the numerous original artworks that capture the likeness of Herbert Hoover, some better than others. The exhibit closes on May 1st, so please come soon. The National Historic Site and the Historic Buildings and Visitor Center are also open for you to enjoy and explore. And don't forget to join us Thursday, May 19th, as we welcome back Annette Dunlap, who will present a program on Lou Henry Hoover called A Woman of Adventure, The Life and Times of First Lady Lou Henry Hoover. Her long-awaited biography will also be coming out this June by Bison Books, an imprint of the University of Nebraska Press. Registration is now open for that program on hooverpresidentialfoundation.org or through your favorite public library. The Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is ready to assist you with your membership needs or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus and museum renovation. You can learn more about that and even show your support at timelessvaluescampaign.org. On behalf of all of us at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, we thank you for joining us and look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus.